On July 26, 1941, the United States government froze every Japanese financial asset on American soil, and within 72 hours, Imperial Japanese Navy war planners had calculated their position with brutal precision. 43 million barrels of oil remained in reserve, somewhere between 1 and 2 years of operational capacity. After that, the warships stopped moving, the aircraft stopped flying, and the empire ceased to function as a military power. What happened next was not fanaticism. It was arithmetic. This is the story of why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, a decision made not by madmen, but by rational actors trapped in a resource death spiral they had spent a decade engineering for themselves, choosing a desperate gamble over a slow and certain decline. The man who designed the attack spent the weeks before it writing letters predicting Japan's defeat. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had studied at Harvard, toured American oil fields, and watched the smokestacks of Detroit from the decks of a visiting warship. His words to Prime Minister Kono Fumimaro in the summer of 1941 were measured and final. If ordered to fight, I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years. Those words reached Kono in the same month Yamamoto's staff was finalizing operational plans for the attack he had forced through the Naval General Staff by threatening to resign. The architect of Pearl Harbor was also its most clear-eyed critic, and that paradox sits at the center of everything that follows. To understand December 7th, 1941, the story has to begin 10 years earlier and 4,000 miles away at a railway line in Manchuria. On the night of September 18, 1931, officers of the Japanese Guandong Army planted explosives on a section of the South Manchuria Railway near Mukden. The explosion was barely powerful enough to derail a train, and a train passed over the damaged section minutes later without incident. None of that mattered. Japanese troops were mobilized within hours, citing Chinese saboteurs, and within 5 months Japan controlled a territory the size of France and Germany combined. Manchukuo was established in 1932, the deposed Qing Emperor Puyi installed as its nominal ruler, and when the League of Nations condemned the seizure through the Lytton Report, Japan responded in 1933 by walking out of the League entirely. The logic behind Manchuria was identical to the logic that would eventually produce Pearl Harbor. Japan was a resource-poor island chain attempting to sustain an industrial military at a scale its home islands could not support, and Manchuria had coal, iron ore, and agricultural land. Controlling territory meant extracting resources without paying market prices, which meant insulating the empire from the leverage of foreign suppliers. What the architects of Manchukuo failed to anticipate was that this solution planted the seed of the problem that would eventually destroy them. A nation that acquires resources through conquest trains every major trading partner to treat it as a permanent threat. The Second Sino-Japanese War began on July 7, 1937, with similar logic applied to different geography. Near the Lugo Bridge southwest of Beijing, Japanese garrison troops claimed a soldier had gone missing during night maneuvers and demanded entry to the walled town of Wanping. Fighting broke out. The missing soldier had already returned, but the fighting did not stop, and within weeks the Imperial Japanese Army was advancing on Shanghai and Nanjing. Both cities fell. Nanjing fell in December 1937, and the weeks that followed produced what the historical record documents as the Nanjing Massacre, with death toll estimates ranging from 100,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed prisoners. The China War was supposed to be a short campaign. Instead, it became a permanent drain on Japanese manpower, ammunition, and fuel, an occupation of a country too large to fully subdue and too politically significant to abandon. By 1941, the China War was the chain that bound Japan to every decision that followed. Here is the raw material of Japan's strategic crisis, stated plainly. Approximately 90% of Japan's oil came from imports, and between 60 and 80% of that imported oil, the figure varies by source and year, came from the United States. Domestic Japanese oil production ran to roughly 2.7 million barrels per year, drawn from wells at Akita, Niigata, and Nutsu, representing less than 0.1% of world output. That same year, American wells produced approximately 63% of global oil output, something close to 1.35 billion barrels annually. Japan and the United States were not operating at different points on the same spectrum. They occupied different economic universes. The gap extended well beyond oil. Japan pulled 74.1% of its scrap iron from the United States in 1938 and 93% of its copper in 1939. Economic historian Mark Harrison, in his 1998 Cambridge University Press study of World War II economies, placed Japan's real GDP in 1941 at approximately 196 billion international dollars against America's approximately 1,094 billion, a ratio of roughly 5.6 to 1. Historian Paul Kennedy, working from comparable war production data from 1937, arrived at a war-making potential ratio of approximately 12 to 1 in America's favor. These were not figures Japan's planners discovered after the fact. They had calculated them, studied them, and in the sober internal assessments of senior naval officers, concluded that a long war against the United States was unwinnable. The question occupying Japanese strategic planning throughout 1940 and 1941 was never whether Japan could defeat America. The question was whether Japan could land a blow decisive enough to prevent America from fully mobilizing that capacity before a negotiated settlement could be reached. The logic Japan operated on in 1941 mirrors the logic of any competitor who cannot match an incumbent's resources and bets instead on a single disruptive strike delivered before the larger opponent can respond. Hit fast, hit hard. Control the narrative before the other side's scale advantage activates. The same calculation has failed repeatedly across every domain where one party's only advantage is speed and surprise, and for the same reason. Surprise works once, and once the larger competitor has absorbed the blow and begun to mobilize, the inherent advantage of scale asserts itself without exception. Japan's planners understood this too. What makes the decision not irrational but tragic is that they chose the gamble anyway, because the alternative, accepting American demands, withdrawing from China, abandoning the empire, felt worse than a long-shot bet on a short, decisive war. Understanding how Japan made the decision to attack requires understanding how decisions actually moved through the Japanese state. And the answer is considerably more complicated than the image of a militarist dictatorship issuing orders from above. The Imperial Japanese Army in the 1930s was not a unified institution. Two major factions competed for control of its direction and, through it, the direction of the empire. The Kodaha, the Imperial Way faction, was a radical ultranationalist movement led by generals including Sadao Araki and Jinzaburo Masaki, prioritizing confrontation with the Soviet Union, spiritual loyalty to the emperor, and deep suspicion of industrial zaibatsu influence over military culture. The rival faction, which Kodaha members pejoratively labeled the Toziha, the control faction, oriented itself toward technological modernization, total war mobilization with industrial support, and what might be called bureaucratic pragmatism. Among its members was the general who would eventually become Japan's wartime prime minister, Hideki Tojo. On August 12, 1935, a Kodaha-aligned lieutenant colonel named Saburo Aizawa walked into the office of General Tetsuya Nagata, the senior Toziha officer, and assassinated him. The murder triggered a court-martial that the Kodaha tried to use as a public platform, and then on February 26, 1936, approximately 1,400 soldiers under Kodaha-aligned officers occupied key buildings in Tokyo and assassinated several senior government officials in what became known as the February 26th incident. Emperor Hirohito refused to sanction the rebellion. The coup collapsed within 4 days, and the Kodaha was effectively dissolved. Its senior figures faced court-martial, and Tojo's faction consolidated dominance over army policy. That outcome mattered directly for Pearl Harbor because the faction that won the Army's internal power struggle was the one that favored Southern expansion, industrial mobilization, and a strategy built around seizing Southeast Asian resources. the very strategy that would eventually require neutralizing the American Pacific Fleet to execute. Above all of this sat a constitutional structure that made collective responsibility the norm and individual accountability nearly impossible to assign. Critical decisions moved to imperial conferences, Gusenkaigi, where proposals reached the emperor for ratification after being decided at liaison conferences between government and military high command. Hirohito traditionally remained silent during these proceedings. Whether that silence constituted genuine passivity or active endorsement remains among the most contested questions in Pacific War historiography. Herbert Bix, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning 2000 biography Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan, argues that by summer 1941 the emperor was engaged as commander-in-chief in every meaningful sense, and that his approval of the September 6th and November 5th war decisions carried genuine moral and political weight. Critics of Bix, including historians Hata Ikehiko and Peter Wetzler, contend that within the consensus-based Meiji constitutional system, Hirohito was rarely expected to override proposals already decided by his cabinet and military chiefs. That debate remains unresolved in the scholarly literature, and this documentary treats it as such. What is not in dispute is the outcome. By autumn 1941, the Japanese institutional machinery, army, navy, cabinet, and imperial household, had locked onto a course that no single actor felt authorized or positioned to reverse. On September 27, 1940, representatives of Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact in Berlin. Article 3 committed the signatories to assist one another with all political, economic, and military means if any of them was attacked by a power not currently involved in the European War or the Sino-Japanese conflict. The phrasing deliberately excluded the Soviet Union, already involved in both, and pointed directly at the United States. Japan's Foreign Minister Matsuoka Yosuke believed that tying Japan to the German war effort would force Washington to recalculate the cost of confronting Tokyo. If attacking Japan meant war with Germany, and Germany at that moment controlled most of Western Europe and appeared to be winning, the United States might conclude that restraint was the wiser course. The calculation failed. The Tripartite Pact did not deter American policy. It accelerated it. Washington read the pact as confirmation that Japan had aligned itself with a bloc actively working to redraw the global order by force. American oil exports to Japan had already been subject to incremental restrictions since the mid-1930s, and the Export Control Act of July 1940 began formalizing bans on high-octane aviation gasoline and certain steel and scrap iron categories. A full ban on scrap iron and steel exports followed in September 1940. Then, on July 24, 1941, Japanese forces completed the occupation of southern French Indochina, territory that put Japanese airfields within range of Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. 2 days later, Executive Order 8832 froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch government in exile followed within hours. Under-Secretary of State Dean Acheson implemented the freeze with a rigidity that went beyond what some historians believe Roosevelt initially intended, and by August 1, 1941, no oil export licenses were being approved. The effective result was a complete embargo. The math that followed was not complicated. Japan consumed approximately 1 million barrels of Navy fuel per month. The Imperial Japanese Navy held roughly 88% of Japan's refined fuel stocks. With American oil cut off, the 43 million barrels in reserve represented somewhere between 1 and 2 years of operational capacity. Japanese leaders did not experience this as economic pressure. They experienced it as a terminal deadline. Between the July 1941 embargo and the December attack, Japan and the United States conducted a sustained diplomatic effort that both sides recognized was probably futile and neither was willing to abandon without attempting. The fundamental gap was this. American policy demanded that Japan withdraw its troops from China and Indochina and recognize only the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek in Chongqing. abandoning the Japanese-backed Wang Jingwei regime in Nanjing. Japan's position was that a decade of blood and treasure had been committed to the China enterprise, and withdrawing without achieving its objectives would represent a humiliation the military could not absorb and the empire could not survive politically. These positions were not reconcilable, and what the diplomacy produced was a protracted exchange in which both sides searched for language that might provide face-saving cover for a compromise neither was actually prepared to make. Prime Minister Kono Fumimaro proposed a direct summit with Roosevelt, a personal conversation that might cut through the formal diplomatic channel. Roosevelt was initially open to it. But before any meeting could be arranged, Washington demanded concrete assurances about Japan's intentions in China, and Kono could not provide them without the Army's agreement. War Minister Tojo refused to endorse any formula that could be read as a withdrawal commitment, and the summit never happened. The September 6, 1941 Imperial Conference then set a deadline. If diplomacy had not produced an acceptable settlement by early October, Japan would begin final preparations for war. Kono resigned on October 16, 1941, unable to bridge the gap. Emperor Hirohito appointed Tojo as prime minister the following day, and Tojo retained the army ministry simultaneously, consolidating military and civilian executive authority in a single figure for the first time. Japan submitted two final proposals. Proposal A, delivered November 6, offered a partial China withdrawal over a period of years and was rejected by Washington on November 14. Proposal B, delivered November 20th, sought a temporary arrangement. Japan would pull back from southern Indochina if the United States ended aid to Chiang, unfroze assets, and supplied what the proposal called a required quantity of oil. Roosevelt considered a counter-proposal along these lines, and then American intelligence showed Japanese troopships moving toward Indochina, and the counter-proposal was withdrawn. On November 26, 1941, Secretary Hull delivered what Tokyo would interpret as America's final word. The document, officially titled Outline of Proposed Basis for Agreement between the United States and Japan, demanded complete Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina, recognition of only the Chiang government, and effective abandonment of the Tripartite Pact's obligations. Hull described it as a restatement of principles that had long been basic in United States foreign policy. Tojo told his cabinet, "This is an ultimatum." Hull was technically correct and Tojo was politically correct, and both assessments captured something real. Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori told his subordinates there was no longer any way to stop war except to topple the cabinet. Nobody toppled the cabinet. Yamamoto Isoroka had been trying to prevent the war that made the Pearl Harbor attack necessary since at least 1936. Born in 1884 in Nagaoka, in Niigata Prefecture, Yamamoto graduated from the Imperial Naval Academy in 1904, lost 2 fingers of his left hand at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, and spent the following decades absorbing a lesson he would carry through every subsequent assignment. Naval power in the modern era was inseparable from industrial and petroleum capacity. Harvard occupied 2 years of his education between 1919 and 1921. A stint as naval attaché in Washington followed, during which Yamamoto toured American oil fields and observed American industrial infrastructure at close range. The conclusion he drew was categorical. Japan could not sustain a protracted war against a nation with that resource base. When Japan signed the Tripartite Pact in September 1940, Yamamoto was serving as Vice Minister of the Navy, and his opposition to it was direct and documented. Allying with Germany, he wrote to a colleague, would guarantee rather than prevent conflict with the United States. His opposition made him a target of ultranationalist anger, and his transfer to the Combined Fleet Command was arranged partly to protect him from assassination by extremist army officers, a genuine concern given the assassinations of the previous decade. As Combined Fleet Commander, Yamamoto faced a strategic contradiction he never fully resolved. The established Japanese naval doctrine, Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle strategy, called for allowing the American fleet to cross the Pacific, exhausting it through submarine and destroyer attrition, then engaging it in a single climactic battle near Japanese waters. Every war game the Navy ran on this premise produced losses the fleet could not sustain. Yamamoto concluded that the decisive battle doctrine was a path to defeat, and that if war was coming regardless of his wishes, destroying the American Pacific Fleet at the outset, in port, before it could deploy, was the only approach with any chance of success. Discussions of a Pearl Harbor strike began between Yamamoto and Vice Admiral Fukudome Shigeru as early as March or April of 1940. A formal memorandum followed on January 7, 1941, addressed to Navy Minister Oikawa Koshiro, arguing that Japan's only viable path was to eliminate the American fleet before American industrial capacity could be brought to bear. Rear Admiral Onishi Takejiro was ordered to study the plan's feasibility, and Commander Jinda Minoru, one of the most gifted aviation planners in the Navy, came aboard to develop it operationally in February 1941. The Naval General Staff resisted. Admiral Nagano Osami and his planners argued that the operation risked the entire carrier force, depended on an impossible standard of surprise, and that failure would be catastrophic. Yamamoto threatened to resign his command if the plan was not approved. The Naval General Staff gave way in late September or early October 1941. The plan drew on a proof of concept established 11 months earlier on the other side of the world. On November 11, 1940, British carrier aircraft attacked the Italian fleet anchored at Taranto Harbor, sinking or damaging 3 Italian battleships in shallow water, using aerial torpedoes fitted with wooden fins to prevent them from diving too deep on entry. Japanese Assistant Naval Attaché Lieutenant Commander Takashi Nato investigated the Taranto attack and reported his findings to Japanese aviation planners, and Jinda's team used the tactical approach as a template, modifying Japan's Type 91 torpedo with similar anti-roll fins to operate in Pearl Harbor's shallow anchorage. Popular accounts often present Taranto as the inspiration for Pearl Harbor. The historical record is more precise. Yamamoto had already been discussing the Pearl Harbor concept months before Taranto happened, which means Taranto provided not the idea, but the proof. Evidence that shallow water aerial torpedo attacks on a harbored fleet were operationally feasible rather than merely theoretical. War games for the operation ran at the Japanese Naval War College from September 2 to 5, 1941. On November 5, Hirohito approved the operational plan at an imperial conference, and Yamamoto issued top-secret Operation Order No. 1, setting Y-Day as December 8 in Japan time, December 7 in Hawaii. The strike force departed Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, the same day the Hull note arrived in Washington. A final imperial conference on December 1 gave approval to proceed. The force could have been recalled. It was not. The striking force Yamamoto assembled for Operation Z was, in the assessment of the United States Naval History and Heritage Command, the most powerful carrier task force assembled to that point in history. 6 fleet carriers formed its core: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Between them, they carried more than 400 aircraft. For the attack itself, 353 aircraft would strike in 2 waves, with 48 more flying combat air patrol above the task force. Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, designated Kate in Allied nomenclature, carried the modified Type 91 torpedoes toward the battleships moored along Ford Island. Aichi D-3A dive bombers, VALs, targeted airfields, cruisers, and anything the torpedo planes missed. Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters, at that point arguably the finest carrier fighter in the world, moved to suppress American air defenses and establish air superiority over Oahu. The surface escort consisted of 2 fast battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 9 destroyers, with tankers for underway replenishment during the transit across the North Pacific. 5 Kohayatiki-class midget submarines were assigned to penetrate Pearl Harbor through the entrance and attack from inside, while the airwaves struck from above. The route chosen, across the North Pacific, well north of normal shipping lanes, minimized the risk of chance observation by merchant vessels. The fleet maintained radio silence throughout. The Japanese diplomatic mission in Washington continued negotiations, maintaining the appearance that a settlement was still possible. On the American side, the signals were present but never assembled into a coherent picture. The Army's SCR-270 radar station at Opana Point on Oahu's northern shore was operating the morning of December 7th. At 7:02 a.m., Privates Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott detected an unusually large formation of aircraft approaching from the north, approximately 132 miles out, and reported the contact to the Information Center at Fort Shafter. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, the duty officer, told them not to worry. The contact was probably a scheduled flight of B-17 bombers expected from California. The radar operators watched the blip until it disappeared into ground return at 7:39 a.m. and then shut down for the day. At 6 a.m., approximately 230 miles north of Oahu, Commander Fukuda Mitsuo lifted off the deck of the Akagi in his Nakajima B-5N, and 182 aircraft followed him into the Hawaiian dawn. At 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, the first wave reached Oahu, and what Fukuda found below matched the planning models with uncomfortable precision. Battleship rows stretched along the southeast side of Ford Island. Arizona, Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, Oklahoma, California, Nevada, and Pennsylvania were all present. Enterprise was delivering aircraft to Wake Island. Lexington was on a similar mission to Midway. Saratoga was on the west coast for maintenance. The three carriers that would win the Battle of Midway 6 months later were all absent, and Fukuda would have had no way of knowing in that moment how much that absence would cost Japan. Assessing the scene from altitude, seeing no fighter opposition rising to meet him, Fukuda transmitted at 7:53 a.m. Tora, 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 the code phrase signaling complete surprise. The first torpedo hit the battleship Oklahoma at approximately 7:55 a.m. For the next 90 minutes, 353 Japanese aircraft worked through Pearl Harbor and the surrounding airfields in 2 waves. The second wave of 171 aircraft, carrying more dive bombers and no torpedo planes, struck at approximately 8:54 a.m., targeting anything the first wave had left standing and continuing to hit Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Kaneohe Naval Air Station, and Bellows Field. An armor-piercing bomb struck the battleship Arizona and penetrated the forward magazine, detonating approximately 1.77 million pounds of black powder propellant in an explosion visible from Honolulu 14 miles away. Arizona sank in roughly 9 minutes. Approximately 1,177 members of her crew died, nearly half the total American death toll from the entire attack, and the ship remains on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, designated a national memorial. Oklahoma capsized. Utah capsized. West Virginia and California sank at their moorings. Maryland, Tennessee, Nevada, and Pennsylvania were hit and damaged but survived. Nevada attempted to sortie through the harbor entrance during the attack, absorbed repeated hits from the second wave, and was run aground to avoid blocking the channel. All 7 surviving battleships were eventually returned to service. When the attack ended, 2,403 Americans were dead, including 68 civilians killed mainly by improperly fused American anti-aircraft shells falling on Honolulu residential neighborhoods. Another 1,178 Americans were wounded. 188 aircraft were destroyed and 159 more damaged. Japan lost 29 aircraft, less than 10% of the attacking force, and roughly 64 Japanese personnel were killed. All 5 midget submarines were lost. One crewman, Kazuo Sakamaki, was captured after his vessel ran aground, becoming the first Japanese prisoner of war taken by the United States in the Pacific conflict. To understand why Pearl Harbor failed as a strategic operation, the story has to focus not on what Japanese aircraft destroyed, but on what they left standing. The attack targeted the battleships because they represented the symbolic and traditional center of American naval power, and because destroying them was the plan's explicit objective. The battleship was the vessel that doctrine had identified as the decisive weapon of fleet-on-fleet combat since the late 19th century. Yamamoto himself had built his career on a different premise, that carrier aviation was displacing the battleship as the arbiter of naval warfare, but the plan's target list reflected the consensus view of naval power as it had existed before carriers proved their dominance. The fuel tank farms were not hit. Pearl Harbor held approximately 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil in above-ground storage tanks on the shores of the harbor, a supply sufficient to sustain American Pacific operations for months. The tanks were unfortified, entirely visible from the air, and Japanese planners had discussed targeting them before concluding that the primary objective of crippling the battle fleet was sufficient. If the battle fleet was destroyed, there would be no ships to fuel. The tanks survived. The submarine base survived without meaningful damage, and in the months that followed, American submarines operating from Pearl Harbor began an interdiction campaign against Japanese merchant shipping that would strangle Japan's resource supply lines more thoroughly than any single military action could have achieved. The repair facilities and dry docks also survived, which meant the ships the Japanese Navy had written off as permanently destroyed were being raised, patched, and returned to service within months. West Virginia came back in 1944. California re-entered service the same year. Nevada was repaired and participated in the Normandy landings in 1944, and the carriers were untouched. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga constituted the offensive striking power on which the next phase of the Pacific War depended, and they were at sea or in maintenance on December 7th. At the Battle of Midway on June 4 through 7, 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, precisely within the window Yamamoto had predicted Japan could run wild. American carrier aircraft sank 4 of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu went to the bottom of the Central Pacific, and with them went Japan's offensive carrier superiority. Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuchi, the strike force commander, chose not to launch a third wave against the fuel and repair facilities. Junior officers, including reportedly Fukuda himself, urged a follow-on strike. Nagumo declined, citing the unlocated American carriers, the time required to rearm and refuel aircraft, and the judgment that the primary objectives had been achieved. Viewed from a risk management standpoint, the decision was defensible. Viewed from the strategic outcome of the Pacific War, it was among the most consequential errors any naval commander made in the conflict. At this point in most documentaries about Pearl Harbor, a specific quote appears. It is attributed to Yamamoto. It says, in various versions, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Yamamoto never said that. Screenwriter Larry Forrester and producer Elmo Williams wrote the line for the closing scene of the 1970 film Tora, and Williams later claimed it came from a 1943 Yamamoto letter that has never been produced by anyone. Gordon Prang, whose research archive yielded the definitive scholarly account of Pearl Harbor, found no evidence the quote existed. Hiroyuki Agawa's biography, The Reluctant Admiral, the standard English-language scholarly life of Yamamoto, does not contain it. No Japanese primary source contains it. No contemporary American intelligence document quotes it. The line was written for a film, attributed to history, and repeated so many times that correcting it feels like vandalism. It should feel like the opposite. What Yamamoto actually said, in verified primary sources, is both more precise and more revealing. When Kono asked about war prospects in mid-1941, Yamamoto's reply was direct. "If ordered to fight, I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years." That is not theatrical warning language. That is the operational analysis of a strategist who had studied American industrial capacity for decades and concluded that time was the variable Japan could not control. The prediction landed within weeks of accurate. The Battle of Midway, the inflection point at which Japanese operational momentum broke, occurred 5 months and 27 days after Pearl Harbor. On January 9, 1942, 1 month after the attack he had designed, Yamamoto wrote to journalist Ogata Take Tora, A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame, simply, for the one smitten. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack. That is the authentic Yamamoto, not triumphant, not quoting himself about sleeping giants, but ashamed of the mode of the attack and fully aware of what the American response would bring. The verified record is more damning and more human than the Hollywood version, and it is also the true one. At 7:58 a.m. on December 7th, 1941, while the first wave was still working through Pearl Harbor, the commander of the 14th Naval District broadcast across every ship and station in the Pacific, "Air raid Pearl Harbor." This is not drill. In Washington, Secretary Hull was meeting with Japanese ambassadors Kichisaburo Nomura and Saburo Kurusu to receive the final 14-part diplomatic message that Tokyo had intended as a formal break in negotiations, delivered by design at 1 p.m. Washington time, approximately 30 minutes before the attack was scheduled to begin. The message arrived late. Decryption and translation delays pushed Nomura and Kurusu to Hull's office at 2:20 p.m., nearly an hour after the attack had begun and after Hull had already received phone calls informing him of the strike. Hull listened to the ambassadors deliver their message, then told them, in language the diplomatic record describes as unusually direct, that in 50 years of public service he had never seen a document more crowded with falsehoods and distortions. The meeting lasted perhaps 10 minutes. At 12:30 p.m. on December 8, 1941, Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress. The speech ran 518 words and took approximately 6.5 minutes. The draft had read, "A date which will live in world history," and Roosevelt crossed that out by hand in the car on the way to the Capitol and wrote "infamy" instead. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. An estimated 81% of American homes tuned in on the radio, the largest audience in American radio history to that point. The Senate voted 82-0. The House voted 388-1. With the single dissent from Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, the first woman elected to Congress, a lifelong pacifist who had also voted against American entry into the First World War in 1917. Roosevelt signed the declaration at approximately 4 p.m. A Gallup poll conducted December 12 through 17 found 97% of Americans approved of Congress declaring war on Japan, with 2% opposed. Before Pearl Harbor, American isolationism was politically dominant, but concealing a significant undercurrent of concern about Axis expansion that a majority did not feel licensed to express publicly. A Gallup poll from September 1939 found 90% of Americans opposed to declaring war on Germany. By the summer of 1941, close to 8 in 10 Americans continued to say they did not want the United States to enter the war. Pearl Harbor did not change American minds. It gave Americans permission to say publicly what many had been thinking privately, cascading a hidden consensus into visible unanimity in the space of a single morning. The psychological unification the attack was designed to prevent was precisely what it produced. For days after Pearl Harbor, on December 11, 1941, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States, and nothing in the Tripartite Pact required him to do so. The pact's mutual defense obligations applied when a signatory was attacked. Japan had been the attacker at Pearl Harbor, and Germany carried no treaty obligation to enter the American war. Hitler declared war anyway. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop delivered the declaration personally to American Charge d'Affaires Leland B. Morris in Berlin, and according to diplomat George F. Kennan, who was present, Ribbentrop told Morris, "Your president has wanted this war. Now he has it." Hitler's reasoning combined several threads. Japan's surprise attack generated genuine enthusiasm in Berlin. Germany had already been conducting what amounted to an undeclared naval war with the United States in the Atlantic. The American destroyer Reuben James was sunk by a German submarine on October 31, 1941, killing over 100 sailors, and Hitler believed the formal declaration changed little in practice. He held deep contempt for Roosevelt and for what he described as American industrial capacity, and he believed, incorrectly, that American military power was weaker than it appeared. The decision is now regarded as one of the most strategically consequential errors of the entire war. Before Germany's declaration on December 11th, American public opinion, which had rallied overwhelmingly behind the Pacific War, remained divided over whether the United States should also enter the European conflict. By declaring war on the United States, Hitler freed Roosevelt from a political problem that might otherwise have consumed months of diplomatic effort. The Germany First strategic priority, focusing American resources on defeating Germany before Japan, had been decided at staff level in secret Anglo-American conversations before Pearl Harbor. After December 11th, it became official American policy with legal standing and full public backing. Historians Brendan Sims and Charles Latterman have argued that December 11th was in some respects a more important date than December 7th in creating the character of the war as a truly global conflict. The United States was already in the Pacific. Germany's declaration put it simultaneously in Europe on terms that gave Roosevelt exactly the mandate he needed. No aspect of Pearl Harbor has generated more controversy, more declassified documents, more congressional investigations, and more sustained scholarly argument than a single question. Did the Roosevelt administration know the attack was coming and allow it to happen? The question has a serious pedigree and deserves a serious answer. The revisionist case, that American policy deliberately provoked Japan and that senior officials had foreknowledge of the attack, has been developed over 80 years by historians with genuine scholarly credentials. Charles A. Beard, one of the most respected American historians of the early 20th century, published President Roosevelt and the Coming of the War, 1941 and 1948, arguing that Roosevelt had maneuvered the United States into the conflict against the expressed will of the public. George Morgenstern, Charles Callan-Tansil, and later John Toland developed variations of this argument across subsequent decades, and the most detailed modern version appeared in Robert Stinnett's Day of Deceit, published in 1999. Stinnett argued, based on documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, that American cryptanalysts were reading Japanese naval codes before the attack, and that Roosevelt and his senior advisors had allowed the strike to proceed in order to bring the country into the war. The scholarly response was direct and consistent. Cryptanalyst Philip Zelikow demonstrated that Japan's main naval operational cipher, JN 25, had been changed shortly before the attack and was not being read by American cryptanalysts in the weeks leading up to it. The cipher was not broken again until May 1942. CIA historian Donald Sturry wrote that Stinnett had concocted his theory from whole cloth and that the author had fabricated sources or misrepresented what sources actually said. Historians Frederick Borch and Daniel Martinez, the chief historian at the USS Arizona Memorial, called the charges totally false. Gordon Prang described the foreknowledge conspiracy as an absurdity. John Keegan wrote that Stinnett's charges defied logic. Specific documented errors in Day of Deceit include misreading a date stamp as December 5, 1941, references to Japanese code wheels that did not exist, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the tripartite pact structure that formed a key link in the argument. A separate and more defensible version of the revisionist position holds not that Roosevelt had foreknowledge of the specific attack, but that American policy was designed to pressure Japan into a war that would bring the United States into the European conflict. That claim, U.S. policy created conditions that made war more likely, is a defensible historical position that mainstream scholarship increasingly acknowledges. Roosevelt knew the specific attack was coming and let it happen, is a claim the evidence does not support. A 1995 Pentagon study and separate Senate action in 1999 concluded that responsibility for the failures at Pearl Harbor was broadly shared across the command structure. but found no evidence of foreknowledge at the senior executive level. The revisionist tradition asks important questions about American policy and its role in the escalation to war, and those questions deserve engagement rather than dismissal. The specific conspiracy thesis, examined exhaustively by historians with access to the same declassified documents Stinnett used, has not survived contact with the evidence. The man who transmitted Torah, and circled Oahu for nearly 3 hours directing the attack from his Nakajima B-5N, absorbing, by his own account, approximately 21 anti-aircraft hits without being shot down, survived the war, and then lived a second life that was, in some respects, more extraordinary than the attack itself. Fukuda Mitsuo was present at a striking number of critical moments in the Pacific War. At Midway in June 1942, he was injured during the battle and evacuated, a fact that may explain some of the embellishments historians have since found in his operational accounts. At Hiroshima on August 5, 1945, Fukuda departed the city the night before the atomic bomb destroyed it, and later described returning to survey the aftermath. At the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, Fukuda attended as a representative of the Imperial Japanese Navy, watching the formal end of the war he had helped begin. In the spring of 1950, Fukuda converted to Christianity. 2 encounters shaped it. Jacob de Shazer, one of the Doolittle raiders who had struck Tokyo in April 1942, was captured after his plane ran out of fuel, spent years in captivity under harsh conditions, and after the war wrote a pamphlet titled, "I Was a Prisoner of Japan," describing his Christian conversion. A copy reached Fukuda. Separately, Fukuda had been searching for an American nurse said to have cared for Japanese prisoners of war with notable compassion despite the fact that Japanese soldiers had killed her missionary parents in the Philippines. Her name was Peggy Covell, and her choice of forgiveness over bitterness reached Fukuda at a level his post-war secular existence had not provided. Baptized in April 1950, Fukuda subsequently worked as an evangelist with an organization called the Worldwide Christian Missionary Army of Sky Pilots, founded the Captain Fukuda Evangelical Association, and settled for a period in Seattle, Washington. His memoir From Pearl Harbor to Calvary was published in 1959. Fukuda died on May 30, 1976, in Japan. Some of his post-war operational accounts, including his advocacy for a third wave at Pearl Harbor and his detailed description of Midway's critical minutes, have been challenged by historians Jonathan Parshall and Alan Zim as self-serving and in certain particulars unreliable. His conversion appears genuine. The officer who led the attack that brought the United States into the deadliest war in human history spent the second half of his life traveling American churches and community halls, speaking in accented English about forgiveness, accepting handshakes from veterans who had been in the water at Pearl Harbor. The Pearl Harbor attack produced 2 formal scapegoats immediately and 1 ongoing political controversy that has continued into the present. Admiral Husband Kimmel commanded the Pacific Fleet on December 7, 1941, and General Walter Short commanded the Army's Hawaiian Department. Both were relieved within 10 days of the attack. By December 17, Kimmel had reverted to Rear Admiral, losing 2 stars, and both officers were preparing to testify before the first of what would eventually become 9 official investigations into Pearl Harbor. The Roberts Commission, reporting in January 1942, found both men guilty of dereliction of duty for failing to establish adequate defensive measures in the face of available warning signals, and the press and public accepted the finding as the definitive explanation for how the attack had succeeded. The actual history was more complicated. Washington had been receiving intelligence through the MAGIC program, the decryption of Japanese diplomatic messages encoded in the purple cipher, that clearly indicated a Japanese attack somewhere in the Pacific was imminent. The 14-part message breaking off negotiations circulated in Washington on the night of December 6 through 7. An Army intelligence officer named Colonel Rufus Bratton tried unsuccessfully to reach Army Chief of Staff George Marshall that night to discuss the message's implications. The 1 o'clock portion of the message, specifying that Japanese ambassadors should deliver the break in negotiations to Hull at precisely 1 p.m. Washington time on December 7th, was flagged by intelligence analysts as potentially significant because 1 p.m. Washington time corresponded to 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii. A warning was dispatched to Kimmel and Short on the morning of December 7th, not by military radio due to atmospheric interference, but by Western Union telegram. The telegram arrived in Honolulu after the attack had begun and was delivered by a bicycle messenger during the raid. A 1944 Naval Court of Inquiry largely exonerated Kimmel, directing significant blame instead toward Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark for failing to ensure the Pacific Fleet received available intelligence. Kimmel spent the rest of his life arguing that he and Short had been made to bear responsibility for failures that properly belonged in Washington. On May 25, 1999, the United States Senate passed a non-binding resolution by a vote of 52 to 47 recommending that both men be posthumously restored to their highest wartime ranks, Kimmel to full admiral, Short to lieutenant general. Senator Strom Thurmond called them the two final victims of Pearl Harbor. No president has acted on the resolution. Both men died before it passed. In the weeks and months following the attack, the United States began the mobilization that Japan had calculated the Pearl Harbor strike would prevent or delay. The calculation was wrong on both counts. On February 19, 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced removal of persons deemed threats to national security from designated military areas. Applied almost exclusively to people of Japanese descent living on the West Coast, the order resulted in the incarceration of approximately 120,000 people in inland camps by the end of the war, roughly two-thirds of them American citizens by birth, Nisei who had never lived in Japan. The Supreme Court upheld the internment in Korematsu versus United States in 1944. Congress formally repudiated the decision in 1988 with the Civil Liberties Act, issuing a formal apology and authorizing reparations of $20,000 to surviving internees. American industrial mobilization validated every prediction that had led Japanese planners to understand they could not win a long war, and it did so faster than anyone in Tokyo had assumed possible. American steel production in 1941 already ran to approximately 82 to 83 million tons, roughly 15 times Japan's output, and automobile manufacturers converted to tank and aircraft production within months of the attack. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, repurposed from automobile manufacturing, eventually produced one B-24 Liberator bomber per hour. American shipyards that had been building commercial vessels began producing destroyers and carriers. By 1944, the United States was producing more military aircraft per month than Japan produced in the entire year of 1941. Japan's planners had modeled American GDP. What they had not modeled was the possibility that American GDP could operate at full utilization for 4 consecutive years. The American economy in 1941 still carried significant idle capacity from the Depression decade, and the war provided the demand signal and institutional authorization to deploy it simultaneously. The gap between potential and actual output, the slack that any civilian economy carries, was the variable left out of Japanese calculations, and it proved decisive. The empire's timetable had been built on the assumption that American industrial mobilization would require years to activate. In the event, it required months. The question historians most frequently return to when examining Pearl Harbor is not whether the attack succeeded as a military operation. Within its own terms, it did. The question is whether the strategy it was designed to serve was ever coherent, and the evidence provides a consistent answer: no. Japan's strategic plan in December 1941 rested on 4 assumptions. Destroying. The American battleship fleet would eliminate the United States' capacity and will to contest Japanese expansion in the Western Pacific. Japan could secure and develop Southeast Asian resources quickly enough to sustain a long war if negotiations failed. The shock of the attack would produce political pressure in the United States for a negotiated settlement on terms Japan could accept. And Germany's continued military success in Europe would prevent the United States from focusing its full industrial capacity on the Pacific. All four assumptions were wrong. The battleship fleet was not the relevant American asset. The carriers were. The fuel and repair infrastructure survived. The psychological effect of the attack was the opposite of demoralization, producing a 97% approval rating for the war declaration and collapsing the isolationist movement that had been the primary political obstacle to American belligerence. Germany's military fortunes were already beginning to reverse, with the Wehrmacht's advance on Moscow stalling in December 1941, the same month as Pearl Harbor. And the resource base Japan seized in Southeast Asia required shipping to move its output back to Japan, shipping that American submarines spent the next 4 years systematically destroying. The famous ratio at the heart of this story, American real GDP approximately 5.6 times Japan's, war-making potential approximately 12 times Japan's, was not a secret from Japanese planners. The Naval General Staff had wargame scenarios in which American industrial mobilization proceeded at realistic speed, and the results were consistently unfavorable to Japan beyond the first 18 months. What Japanese planning failed to model adequately was the American response to the specific form the attack took: a surprise strike on a Sunday morning before a formal declaration of war. Yamamoto had understood that the attack would need to be accompanied by a diplomatic break delivered before the bombs fell. The 14-part message was supposed to arrive in Washington at 1 p.m. on December 7th, approximately 20 minutes before the first bomb hit Pearl Harbor. It arrived late. Nomura and Kurusu reached Hull after the attack had already begun, and the framing of the strike as a treacherous assault, while negotiations were nominally ongoing, was not incidental to the American political response. It was central to it. The outrage that produced the 97% approval rating, that dissolved overnight the isolationist movement, keeping the United States out of the war, that unified a divided country. All of it was produced specifically by the timing gap between diplomatic message and military strike. Japan had tried to thread a needle. The timing failed. And that failure, a bureaucratic delay in Tokyo's foreign ministry decryption and transmission process, may have been as consequential as anything that happened over Pearl Harbor itself. On April 18, 1943, 16 months after Pearl Harbor, a flight of American P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted a Japanese transport aircraft over the Solomon Islands. Inside was Yamamoto Isoroku. American signals intelligence had decoded a Japanese message detailing the admiral's inspection itinerary, and Operation Vengeance was planned and executed specifically to kill the man who had designed the attack on Pearl Harbor. Both transport aircraft were shot down. Yamamoto's body was found in the jungle near Ben, Bougainville, still strapped into his seat, in dress uniform, his hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. He was 58 years old. The man who had written, "I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years," died in the second year. The man who had argued that a military officer can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy, it is more a matter of shame, was killed by the enemy he had struck. And the man who had built his career on the argument that Japan's naval doctrine was inadequate for the war Japan was fighting did not live to see that argument proved correct at every subsequent engagement from Midway to the Philippine Sea. What remains, at a distance of 80 years, is a decision that was not irrational. That is the thing worth holding on to. Japan's leaders in 1941 were not fanatics who attacked out of divine conviction or militarist delusion. They were rational actors who had built an empire on the premise that resource acquisition through conquest was sustainable, who encountered the terminal consequence of that premise in the form of an oil embargo, who calculated their options with considerable rigor, and who chose the least bad option among options that were all bad. The tragedy is not that they were irrational. The tragedy is that they were correct about the problem. The oil embargo was a genuine death sentence for the empire on its existing trajectory, and catastrophically wrong about the solution. The logic that produced Pearl Harbor failed not because it was emotional, but because it contained an error that rational analysis should have caught. The assumption that the United States would respond to a surprise attack by seeking negotiation rather than mobilizing for total war. That assumption was contradicted by everything Japan's own analyses had concluded about American industrial capacity and American political psychology. And yet the plan proceeded. The attack designed to deter American intervention created the political conditions under which American intervention became not only inevitable but unanimous. The 43 million barrels of oil Japan had stockpiled by July 1941 ran out on schedule. The carriers absent from Pearl Harbor on December 7 were present at Midway on June 4, 1942. The fuel tanks and repair facilities left untouched continued to supply and restore the fleet that would eventually return to the Western Pacific. American public opinion, which the attack was designed to fracture, responded by producing a 97% war approval rating. Every piece of the gamble that was designed to work failed. The one piece that worked as designed, the tactical strike itself, 353 aircraft, 90 minutes, 2,403 Americans killed, 29 Japanese aircraft lost, succeeded completely. By the standards of the operation's own objectives, it was a success. By the standards of the war it was supposed to prevent, it was the first and most decisive step toward defeat. Yamamoto knew that before the first plane left the deck of the Akagi. He said so in writing. He forced the plan through anyway, because within the institutional logic of the Japanese Empire in 1941, no viable alternative remained. The gamble was not made by madmen. It was made by rational actors who had run out of good options and chose the only remaining path that carried any chance at all, however small. The sleeping giant quote was written for a film. The real Yamamoto was ashamed of what he had done before the smoke had cleared. The empire he served committed itself to a war it could not win before the first torpedo hit the water. The math, in the end, was simple. Japan could not manufacture oil, and the United States produced 63% of the world's supply. Everything else was detail.